Hi, this is Sam Adams in MUS 640, and this is my presentation on how the brain perceives music called Braving the Elements. Basically, this presentation is going to do a few things. It's going to define the elements of music, how they affect our brains and what our brains like about them or dislike about each element, and the real-world applications of the element according to our brains and how we think. So first of all, the elements, there's some debate on what elements are actually considered elements and what things are parts of other elements. But the ones that I mainly found were melody, harmony, rhythm, dynamics, timbre, tempo, meter, and texture. And there were a few other ones, like I said, that were kind of built into these, but these are the main ones I chose to focus on. Melody is defined as a coherent succession of pitches. A pitch is just a scientific term for a frequency the sound wave travels. So a higher frequency means it travels faster and it's a higher pitch. Pitch is also related to the key or the tonal center. Key is defined as certain melodic tendencies and harmonic relations that maintain the tonic as the center of attention. In other words, it's the thing that we keep hearing, the note we keep hearing that we go back to, or we want to hear the music return back to. And the Western music relies on this idea of home, or the tonic note. Based on this tonic note and what's happening in our expectations from culture and what we've heard in other music, our brain makes a logical prediction as we listen to music to try to figure out when we're going to get back to this tonal center. If that prediction we make is correct, we tend to like the music more, and if the prediction is incorrect, we tend to dislike the music more. If it's less predictable, we tend, on a whole, not to like it as much. Harmony is the relationship of tones considered as the sound simultaneously. So basically, we think of this as chords. So sounds that are happening all at the same time, whatever those sounds are. Usually we think of harmony in terms of the same instrument, but it can be across many different instruments. Harmonic choices by composers are used to paint different moods and different styles, different attitudes in a piece of music. Western music relies really heavily on the 1-4-5 chord progression, or some slight variation of that, but too much variation, too much distance away from what we're expecting, kind of like with melody, it makes our brains wrong in their assumptions, so we tend to dislike that more if we can't predict it as easily. For rhythm, I've always defined this to my classes as a pattern of sounds and silences, and then I go on and tell them that the sounds are called notes, silences are called rests. In Western music, things are typically grouped into sections of 4, like 4 beats in a measure or 4 16th notes in a quarter note, and we usually have 4 8-measure phrases in music. And all these rhythms are based on a duration or a length of time, and all of these have concrete lengths of time, which of course can change based on tempo, but they're worth a certain number of beats. So as I always tell my students, rests are just as important as notes, because without the silences, without the rest, you just have one long sound, and no one wants to listen to one long sound. There are combinations of rhythms, and certain rhythms could be more or less pleasing to our brain depending on how easy they are for us to follow. And this can also vary a little bit with experience and culturally. In some cultures, many cultures outside of Western cultures, like in Africa, for example, or Asia, music and dance are usually taught together. So it's not like you can play music or dance. They do both most of the time. In my paper, I didn't put it in this presentation, but in my paper there's actually an example of an African tribe. A man was going there, a musicologist, trying to study their dance and their music, and he was asking them what their word for dance is, and they told him the same word for music, because to them it was the same thing, so they don't have a separate word for it. It's all the same idea. Dynamics are just the loudness or softness of the sound. Most of the modern music, like pop and rock, does not change dynamics much. It may start loud or start soft, but usually whatever it starts at, it pretty much maintains the rest of the way through. Our brain constantly analyzes music and looks for patterns, just like it has with the other elements we've discussed so far. And sudden changes can trigger a danger response in our brains, such as if we're outside and we hear tires screech, or we hear a horn honk or explosions. Those things are things that signal danger to us. They're not typically pleasant volume changes. Timbre is the quality of a sound that makes it different from another sound. So, for example, a piano sounds different than a trumpet, and that sounds different than a drum. Or you could also think of it as my voice sounds different than your voice. So everybody has a different timbre, different sound. A really good example of this is Peter and the Wolf by Prokofiev. The flute, clarinet, and oboe and other instruments all portray certain characters by their sound. which means that the audience can both see, they can see the performer playing it, but they can also hear the character change when that character comes back on, because this is also a play as well as just a piece of music. Timbre with other elements has a lot to do with how we perceive threats, kind of similar to how I talked about dynamics a minute ago. Even if you play something loud, for example, on a harp, it's not going to sound threatening, because harp, we perceive the timbre of a harp as calming or soothing. But if we hear sirens, even if they're very soft and way off in the distance, we know that we associate that timbre, that sound of a siren, with danger or harm or something bad. So it doesn't necessarily have to be loud and aggressive to be associated with danger in our brains. The timbre has a lot to do with that too. Tempo is the speed of the beat judged by the pulse, which we also call the beat. We always talk about pulse in terms of BPM, or beats per minute. Meter is just the division of beats into certain groups. So we have, of course, like duple meter like 2444, and we have triple meter like 6898. It's all related to tempo. It's all similar to rhythm and tempo. They're kind of related here as meter. Meter was another one of the potential elements that some people discussed as a separate element, but I chose to group it with tempo because it's kind of related to tempo, kind of related to rhythm, so it's a little bit of both. The human body and the brain are designed to try to match outside stimuli the best they can so that they can be relaxed and not stressed by outside stimuli. So when we listen to music, our brains kind of regulate our heart rate and our breathing to most closely match the beat of that music. It's kind of like if we're walking next to somebody and we realize we're walking at the same speed as them, or our steps are lining up with theirs. It's kind of the same idea as that. We try to match what's going on around us so we feel more at ease. We don't feel an anxiety in our minds. Texture is layers of sound together. For example, an orchestra has a texture of strings, if it's just a string orchestra, not a symphonic group, of course. Whereas a band or even a symphonic group would have a texture made up of winds of percussion, or symphonic would have strings in addition to that. A choral group would obviously just have voices in it, or maybe voices in piano to have an accompanist. The brain sifts through all these textures in the world around us, not just in music, but in our everyday lives, to determine which ones could be sounds of danger and which ones are not. So, for example, again, going back to the idea of traffic or cars, if we're walking down a street in the city, we could hear lots of things happening, like we could hear a jackhammer in the distance, but that's not a threat to us, even though it's a loud, aggressive sound. But if we hear someone yell, "Watch out," or we hear a tire screech or something like that, we have to separate, our brain has to separate that texture or that one sound from the texture of the city around us and decide if that one sound is dangerous or not, or can signal danger. Conclusions. All elements work together to give us a clear idea of the world around us, kind of what I was talking about just a minute ago with texture. They all kind of group together a little bit. It's not like one is more important than the other one, especially in music. Skilled composers and musicians can take advantage of all these different networks in our brain and the way we're wired to bring a lot of emotion and moods into their work, into their pieces. And even with these ideas that we've come up with in this research, more research is definitely needed to fully understand all the ways that we interact with music and music affects our brain, or we interact with just sounds in our daily lives. Here are my references. And thank you for watching my presentation.